You're watching Coping with COVID-19 for Tuesday, April 28th. I'm Haley Wooden. First, a quick COVID-19 news update before our regular video interview. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau today said that some 44,000 businesses have so far applied to the federal government's $73 billion wage subsidy program, which covers up to 75% of part of an employee's wages. The goal, of course, is for businesses to retain and in some cases rehire workers and to help the economy ramp up to normal activity. And BC's Education Minister, Rob Fleming, has said that the province is planning for a controlled, phased-in return to some in-class instruction. He has not provided a date for that return or when some changes may occur, but has not ruled out a return to some form of in-class instruction before the end of the regular school year for K-12 students. I'm Haley Wooden. Thanks for watching. Here's our video. A new report from the Conference Board of Canada suggests that global supply chains will be slow to return to pre-pandemic levels. Joining me to discuss this further is Julie Ades, senior economist with the board's Global Commerce Center. Julie, hope you're doing well, and thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
I think this question is on everyone's minds. When will parts of the economy, when will economies in full return to some kind of normal? Tell me why the board thinks that it will take some time before our global supply chains get back to where they were pre-pandemic.
So the pandemic has been disrupting supply chains globally, deterring business investment and consumer spending, and we expect the decline in global exports to be the largest in modern times, even larger than any recent trade war or natural disaster. And so many of Canada's main trading partners, the EU, China, the UK, and especially the United States, have experienced or are experiencing strong supply and demand shocks. So we have seen in countries like China and Singapore that were able to bring their number of COVID-19 cases under control. We have seen in these countries that later on, they retighten their containment measures in an effort to limit a further spread of the virus and a reintroduction of the virus through imported cases. So that suggests that the recovery or the return of global supply chain operations will likely be slow. It will likely be a slow process based on what we've seen so far.
That's interesting. Do you think that some of the containment measures put in place now to address the pandemic as it is will persist not just over the short or medium term, but they might actually become fundamental parts of how we operate as a global supply chain?
There are still many unknowns related to the spread of the virus and the broader implications of the virus. We do know that it's not something that will happen overnight. So we won't see a sudden return to pre-outbreak levels of production or operations through supply chains. So this is something that will be very gradual, and it will likely be a process of trials and errors.
Interesting. I know, of course, there have been issues around growing protectionism in the years leading up to this pandemic, and we've seen examples of it even during the pandemic for products like PPE, for example. What have we learned about sort of this relationship between a pandemic context and how countries maybe behave when it comes to protectionism or protectionist measures?
It's very tempting for governments to impose protectionist measures in times of crisis like the one we are experiencing, and to want to return to an economy that is more self-reliant. We have seen several countries restricting their exports of medical supplies since the start of the outbreak. But the problem with this approach and with those restrictions is that they can often lead to retaliations and reduce trust between trading partners. And this could lead to escalating protectionist measures that could even go beyond medical supply. So that could make our economies even worse off. So instead of taking this protectionist route, it would be more useful and beneficial over the long term to introduce measures that help companies to be more resilient when shocks occur.
That's an important point. You mentioned the word trust. I'm curious, what can economies or countries do to maybe build back trust that may have been lost? Because that's such a fundamental piece of having a healthy trade relationship. It does rely on some element of trust.
Mhm. Well, a global cooperative approach is important in the short term to solve the current health and economic crisis. But as you mentioned, it's also going to be very important over the long term to help restore this trust in global supply chain networks. So we do believe that by cooperating globally, that will set the stage for further cooperation and economic relations in the future.
What are some of the things or the thinking around global supply chains that might change, or what are some of the discussions that we might begin to have as a result of what we're going through now?
Mhm. So the supply chains disruptions that we've been experiencing have been very challenging for businesses. It's going to have profound implications for different countries around the world and different businesses operating in the global economy. But this could also be an incentive for businesses to rethink the way they operate at home and abroad, and how they interact with their suppliers and buyers. And that could also lead potentially to long lasting changes. For example, businesses and consumers are now relying more on digital solutions for economic and social activities. And businesses that can take advantage of online platforms and other digital technologies will likely be in a better position to mitigate the impact of the outbreak. And research has shown that digital technologies can reduce cost for businesses. Smaller firms that use e-commerce platforms have more easily access to global markets, both for buying and selling products, and they remain exporters longer than those operating solely in traditional markets. So that's one approach. Also, businesses could develop and adopt more agile ways of modeling their supply and demand and sourcing their components. And this would allow them to respond more effectively to future supply chain disruptions. May they be from a pandemic or a natural disaster, a trade war, or something else.
Were conversations around, say, being more agile or using new technologies, digital technologies, were they happening pre-pandemic at all, maybe in response to growing protectionism, or are these maybe newer conversations that industries or businesses might be more keen to have simply because it's going to take us longer to recover?
Well, the digitalization of the economy was one of the trends that was occurring before the outbreak of COVID-19. But what we've been experiencing over the last few weeks may be a catalyst that would accelerate that trend. So it may be a wake-up call for some businesses to just reevaluate the way they operate with their supply chains, and to invest in those technologies that would allow them to be more resilient in terms of facing future shocks.
If there are businesses or industries that don't heed that wake-up call, as you put it, and are dealing with this longer return to normal that it might take when it comes to our global supply chains, what are some of the risks? I mean, what does a slower recovery ultimately mean for economies and businesses?
Mm. The businesses that will be more flexible to the current environment, that will adapt based on the new realities that we are facing, will be in a better position um, go through the current crisis. So this is a very challenging environment, but it's also an opportunity to look at lessons learned and to look at different ways to become more flexible in the future. So the global economy was already going through a digitalization process before the outbreak. But right now, with the interruptions in production and the slowdown in some sectors, in many sectors of the economy, this may be an opportunity for businesses to reskill their workers. Since the start of the outbreak, businesses across different sectors have laid off many of their workers or reduced their working hours. So this is a difficult situation for businesses, but um, they can also use this new situation uh, to get some leg room to reskill their workers that are now newly available, so that their business is in a better position to tackle the new business and employment realities that will likely emerge over the next few months.
Mm-hmm. I know in this crisis, for the first time in many people's lives, they've gone to a grocery store, for example, and the shelves were not fully stocked and the store was waiting for a shipment of goods to arrive. What should we be thinking about from a consumer perspective? Any lessons learned or any impacts that consumers may experience as a result of this slower recovery?
Hmm. That's a good question. Consumers also are faced with those new realities. Some consumers that were more hesitant to use online channels before have been faced with a situation where they actually have to use it to be able to obtain some supplies. They order something online and they can go to the store and have curbside pickup. So there are a lot of challenges that we are facing, that we are experiencing, that are causing consumers and business leaders to be exposed to new ways of operating. And so just like businesses, consumers also need to be more flexible and also willing to look at different ways to obtain what they need.
Mm-hmm. In our final couple minutes, Julie, I want to ask you if there's anything we've learned generally about global supply chains and how we can improve them. I think going through a pandemic can certainly point out potential vulnerabilities or weaknesses. Is it clear yet how we might improve our global supply chains?
Mm-hmm. Um, a supply chain is basically a network between a company and its suppliers to produce and distribute a product or a service to a buyer. So typically, supply chains have followed a more linear, just-in-time model, with information moving from suppliers to producers to distributors and to consumers and back. So the problem that we have seen recently is that when there's an interruption or slowdown at one of those supply chain stages, well, the impact is spread very quickly across the rest of the supply chain. So there are some new models that were existing even before the outbreak, that would allow to map a supply chain network and to be more proactive when there's an interruption in one supplier. It would allow a business to change more easily to another supplier where the supply is smoother. It continues to flow. So there are ways to be more agile and flexible in terms of operating supply chains, and this may be a direction that we will likely see more often in the future.
Julie, thank you so much for your insight on this topic. A pleasure speaking with you. Thanks for coming on.
Likewise, thank you so much.
That's Julie Ades, senior economist with the Conference Board of Canada's Global Commerce Centre. You're watching Coping with COVID. Thanks for watching. We'll be back with a new video tomorrow.